Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma.
I'm Zara.
Federal politicians found to have sexually harassed, assaulted or bullied staff could be fined up to 5% of their salary under new draft laws. Legislation tabled in Parliament this week comes nearly 3 years after a workplace review detailed a lack of clear standards of conduct, limited accountability and power imbalances for those within the so-called Canberra bubble.
This workplace culture review, we've spoken about a number of times. It was a huge story in the media. I think many people who had worked in and around Parliament House knew this was the case, but it certainly didn't get the sort of coverage or attention that perhaps was necessary. Can you just run us through what we need to know about how we actually got to the stage of having to have a review about the workplace culture of Parliament House?
Yep. So there are thousands of people who work in Parliament House, from senior ministers to their staffers.
Many of whom are very young.
Exactly. Many of whom are very young, and a huge sort of difference in the power of that group of staffers, I suppose. So from those young workers right to the top of the Prime Minister and the opposition leader. So it's not exactly what you would call a typical workplace. And as you mentioned, the conversation around what kind of workplace it is really intensified in 2021. And that's when former Liberal staffer Brittany Higgins went public with allegations that she was raped inside Parliament House in 2019. After those revelations came to light, there was a lot of criticism around Parliament as being this kind of unregulated Wild West of workplaces. And it all culminated in the then coalition government announcing a formal review into Parliament's workplace culture.
And that review covered a whole host of things. You know, one of the things that it identified is how prevalent drinking alcohol is in Parliament House. If anyone's ever been there for a meeting, or some sort of gathering, there is usually alcohol involved, which is quite rare for, a normal workplace, let alone somewhere where democracy is meant to be thriving. So what did that review end up discovering?
So that review was called the Set the Standard Review, and it received contributions from more than 1,700 individuals to represent a, quote, comprehensive understanding of the culture within Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. Its final report in November 2021 found that more than 1 in 2 people had experienced at least one incident of bullying, sexual harassment, or actual or attempted sexual assault during their time working in Parliament.
That is an absolutely devastating statistic.
Yeah, it was a staggering figure and made a lot of headlines at the time. It made 28 recommendations to introduce new standards into the parliamentary workplace, basically to clean things up.
Yep.
And that included things like better training, a centralised human resources office or hub, and one of the recommendations called for an independent workplace body, or what it called an independent parliamentary standards commission, to enforce behaviour codes for MPs. It called for this initiative to be established within 12 months of November 2021. And 3 years later, legislation to do this has now been tabled in Parliament.
We've spoken about deadlines on the podcast this week. I'd say that's probably missing a deadline yet again. But I just want to recap what it is we've said, because I think one of the really unique parts of Parliament that this report picked up on and this solution is trying to fix is that there was just no HR. If you have a problem, there was no, senior HR person for you to turn to and say, I've been sexually harassed or I've been bullied. And so this specific measure was aimed at addressing that, right?
Yep. So there are separate measures broadly aimed at addressing that, and we'll get to one of them later, which was about this concept of centralising a department to deal with staffing and culture issues, and that there wasn't that kind of hub like there are in other workplaces for people in Parliament. But this commission specifically, the one that we're talking about in terms of what's been tabled in Parliament this week, would be tasked with investigating misconduct complaints as an impartial authority. So it would have powers to investigate complaints against MPs, senators and political staffers to ensure that, quote, both staff and parliamentarians are held to account for their behaviour. So this is all from the recommendations of that report. And the IPSC would also be able to determine and enforce relevant sanctions for breaches.
Okay, so that's the really important part here, which is that there are ramifications and there are tools that this new commission can actually deploy if they investigate something and find that there has been wrongdoing.
Yeah.
What are some of those sanctions, as you put it? What are some of the penalties that we're talking about here?
So under draft legislation tabled this week, MPs and senators face penalties for misconduct, including a fine that would be worth 2 to 5% of their annual salary.
Okay.
Suspension from Parliament, so being kicked out for a designated period.
I mean, sorry, I know I'm being annoying and interrupting, but what's so interesting here is that in a normal workplace, you would lose your job. But here they are elected officials. So
exactly.
What you can actually do is so limited.
It is limited. And that's why I think we're seeing a kind of broad scope of sanctions and it will be up to this body to determine kind of how far they take that. There's also a penalty that would include removing MPs and senators from any committees that they might serve on. Now, something I didn't realise was that parliamentarians who do serve on committees actually get paid more to take on those extra responsibilities. So that sort of sounds like a kind of more administrative sanction, but it would also be a financial penalty. And in terms of what that other fine, the 2 to 5% of the annual pay, might actually look like in real terms, the minimum annual salary of a parliamentarian is over $233,000 per year. So 2% is $4,500. 5% is over $11,000. So we're talking of, at minimum, a penalty of between $4,000 and $11,000 for some parliamentarians. Now, Katie Gallagher, she is the Minister for Finance. She said that the penalty scheme is designed to act as a significant deterrent for members of Parliament and senators to behave badly. So basically, the hope is that these penalties would not have to be imposed, but by existing, they will encourage parliamentarians to behave professionally.
A very broad term there. What does behave professionally mean? Like, what are the sorts of breaches that we're talking about these penalties having to apply for?
So the body will outline and enforce a specific behaviour code that will set out the sort of workplace behavioural requirements. And this will be about fostering respectful and inclusive workplaces, including a ban on bullying, harassment, assault, sexual harassment and discrimination. That behaviour code will be updated after every federal election. So the government of the day can influence what they believe qualifies as misconduct.
Okay.
The whole process will be largely confidential. The only time that we, the public, will ever hear about any kind of sanctions or investigations is if those investigations meet a public interest test. So, for example, if a really senior cabinet minister or senior leader is found to have been in breach of the behaviour code and they're handed down a big penalty, we'll probably hear about that.
When I hear this, I do just think that there is a lot of kind of subjectivity to it, to defining what is good and not good behaviour, to defining what's in the public interest versus what isn't. I imagine that this will take quite a bit of time to actually nut out and understand how it works in practice. And as you already identified, there's an election coming up. So it could all change then again from hypothetically May next year. And you know, for staffers in the building, it could be quite challenging to try and navigate this.
Yeah, it sounds like there is a fair bit of grey in all of this. But I think what Senator Gallagher kind of said about the initiative speaks to the goodwill, I suppose, that senior leaders have about cleaning up the culture of the workplace in Parliament. She said that the 2021 Set the Standard report laid bare the serious issues of bullying, sexual harassment and sexual assault at parliamentary workplaces, and we're trying to change that.
And you mentioned at the top that this is just a draft proposal at the moment. Is this bill expected to pass Parliament?
So it will need either support from the opposition or the Greens and a handful of crossbenchers to get through Parliament. In terms of what we know about current support across Parliament, Shadow Minister for Women Susan Lee said she will closely consider the legislation before deciding whether to support it. The Greens have said they will support the legislation.
Yep.
Green spokesperson for women, Senator Larissa Waters, has welcomed the proposal. She said she wanted to see the commission introduced without further delay and that women and staff have been unsafe in Parliament for far too long. as I mentioned, those recommendations that we discussed in terms of where this has all come from, that was part of a review launched under the previous government.
Yeah.
And there has been broad kind of bipartisan support for some of the recommendations. Gallagher has said that improving the culture of Parliament requires a cross-party effort.
It does feel like it's a bit beyond politics.
Exactly. So if it passes, which it is expected to, the IPSC would be operational from the 1st of October this year.
Okay, so that commission that we've just spoken about, that would come into effect in just a few months if it passes Parliament, which we are expecting to be the case. Before we wrap up, earlier in the pod, you mentioned that there were 28 recommendations in that initial review that was prompted by Brittany Higgins's allegations. What else has happened since that review was handed down? We know it's been years and that this is now being acted upon. What about the other recommendations?
Yep. So one of the big ones, we were talking about that kind of traditional HR department.
Yeah.
Since the review was handed down, there is a government agency that has been created. It's called the Parliamentary Workplace Support Service. It now offers staff HR advice, 24/7 counselling support. It facilitates professional learning programs and things like respect and safety training for safety in the workplace. Now, this workplace support service is important to the draft legislation that we've just discussed, because some misconduct complaints will end up being referred to that agency. So there will be complaints that are escalated that might end up in breaches and sanctions and penalties being handed out. But there will be others that go to this sort of HR body because they will work to kind of mediate those complaints. So the parties involved might be brought together to discuss improvements in workplace relations, and that will be managed by this sort of HR department. More broadly speaking, though, I think in 2021 we saw a really big shift, not just inside Parliament, but in the kind of broader
Canberra bubble.
Yeah, outside of the Canberra bubble, we all started talking about it. And there has certainly been a kind of pendulum swing towards closer scrutiny over what's going on within the walls of Parliament. What kind of a workplace is it? And I think that that has been a change for good and is not going away.
Yeah.
It certainly seems like all eyes are on Parliament and on that place to do better and to become a healthier, happier workplace. So we'll see what happens next.
Well, I'm actually heading into Parliament today, so I'll let you know if anything has changed.
Have fun, Zara.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Daily Aus. If you learnt something new about how Parliament House functions, you can send this to a friend and tell them to hit follow. That is the way that we here at the Daily Aus can grow our podcast and grow our small business. That's all we've got time for today, but we will be back again tomorrow. See ya.